This is the story of how a nickname, not a name, nearly got an innocent man killed by a mob, weeks before the world had ever heard of Jack the Ripper. In that autumn of terror that would define September 1888, London already had a monster, and they called him Leather Apron. In the closing days of August 1888, a woman named Mary Ann Nichols was found dead in Bucks Row, in the East End district of Whitechapel. It wasn't the first violent death in the area that year, but it was the one that lit the fuse. Within days, police and press alike were chasing a single lead. Local women said they'd been harassed, extorted, and threatened by a man who wore a leather apron and demanded money from them, threatening violence if they refused. Nobody had a name for him, so the newspapers gave him one. The Star, a radical evening paper hungry for readers, and one of the loudest voices in the new style of popular journalism sweeping through the Victorian press, ran with the story hardest, and sensational coverage sold copies. East London's Fear sold newspapers faster than anything else in print that autumn. Within days, Leather Apron wasn't just a rumor passed between frightened women on street corners in Whitechapel and Spitalfields. He was a headline. He was a legend. As far as most of London was concerned, he was already guilty. Here's what almost nobody knew at the time. The police had a name for him too. Sergeant William Thick, who had walked the Whitechapel beat for 18 years, knew exactly who the neighborhood meant when they said, Leather Apron. His name was John Pizer, a Polish-Jewish bootmaker who lived on Mulberry Street. Pizer had a record. He'd been arrested before for assaulting someone with a knife, and he had a local reputation for frightening prostitutes. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man a frightened city wanted to find. But knowing his name and catching him were two different problems, and while the police quietly worked their case, the public had already tried and convicted him in print. By early September, the panic had a life of its own. Newspapers speculated freely, and witnesses came forward describing a man in his late 30s, around 5 feet 4 inches tall, thick-set, with cropped black hair and a small mustache. Illustrated papers, including the Illustrated Police News, printed rough sketches of the suspect based on second-hand descriptions. Those sketches did something no police report could. They gave a face, however invented, to the fear, and people started seeing Leather Apron everywhere. That's when the real danger stopped being one man in Whitechapel and became every man who happened to look suspicious in the wrong light. One of the saddest footnotes in the entire panic is Thomas Mills, a 59-year-old cabinet maker with a drinking problem, who was misidentified by a jumpy crowd and merely paid for a crime he had nothing to do with. Mills wasn't dangerous, and he wasn't even close to the age witnesses had described. It didn't matter. Fear doesn't check alibis. On the morning of the 10th of September, 4 days after the murder of Annie Chapman had pushed the panic to a fever pitch, Sergeant Thick decided it was time to act. He walked to Mulberry Street with 3 officers from H Division, and Pizer answered his own door. Thick told him plainly, "You're wanted on suspicion of the Whitechapel murders." Pizer, according to later accounts, said he already knew people meant him when they spoke of Leather Apron, though he claimed he hadn't worn the apron home from work in some time, since he'd been out of a job. Pizer was afraid to walk the streets, and he had every reason to be. Mobs were actively hunting for Leather Apron by name, and if the crowd outside his door had realized who they were looking at, there's a real chance he never would have made it to the police station alive. He didn't have to. Officers got him safely into custody at Lemon Street, and that's where the case against him started falling apart almost as fast as it had been built. His brother and other relatives confirmed his alibi for the night. Annie Chapman was killed. He simply hadn't been in Whitechapel when it happened. Neighbors and friends denied he was even known by the name that half of London had been screaming for days. The key witness the police had been relying on to place him at the scene turned out to be so unreliable that the case collapsed entirely. Coroner Wynne Baxter, presiding over the inquest into the murders, would later make clear just how thin the evidential ground had always been beneath the Leather Apron story. By the following evening, John Pizer walked out of Lemon Street Police Station, a free man, released without charge. What happened next tells you almost everything about Victorian press culture. The moment Pizer was released, journalists didn't apologize. They chased him for an interview. The Press Association got an exclusive with him just 2 days after his release, and it ran in newspapers across the country. The man the press had spent a week turning into a monster was now simply a story to be milked one more time, framed as the human interest angle, the wrongly accused man, finally free to speak. Once Pizer was cleared, some papers pivoted almost overnight. Instead of chasing Leather Apron, they started asking bigger questions about Whitechapel itself. The poverty, the overcrowding, the desperate conditions of the East End slums that had, in their telling, produced a killer in the first place. The panic didn't end. It just changed shape. Here's the part that should unsettle you the most. Inspector Frederick Abberline, one of the lead detectives on the case, wrote in a report weeks later that the terror surrounding Leather Apron had been building among local women for a considerable time before the murders even began, tied to a man who had allegedly been demanding money from them under threat. In Abberline's own words, there was no evidence connecting that man to the killings. The police pursued him anyway, because the fear surrounding his name had become impossible to ignore. Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner at the time, was facing enormous institutional pressure to produce results, and the Leather Apron Panic was only making that pressure worse. Which raises the uncomfortable question historians still argue over. Was there ever a real, singular Leather Apron at all, separate from Pizer? Some researchers believe a genuinely threatening man matching that general description had been operating in Whitechapel before the murders, extorting and frightening women, and that this pre-existing local terror simply attached itself to Pizer once police went looking for a face to put to the name. Others think the whole figure was closer to urban legend, stitched together from secondhand fear, sold by hungry newspapers, and given false solidity by a police force under enormous pressure to produce a suspect. Either way, John Pizer paid the price for it. He was never charged, and he was, by every surviving account, not the killer who would soon be renamed Jack the Ripper, a name that arrived weeks later in the notorious Dear Boss letter, the correspondence that gave the murders their enduring mythology and buried the Leather Apron Panic almost overnight. Yet for close to 2 weeks in September of 1888, his name was the most feared in England. The Leather Apron Panic didn't get its own inquest. It didn't get a memorial.